Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to another edition of Fighting Game Thursday. One series that has been requested on here for me to cover for quite some time has been entries from the Guilty Gear franchise. In fact, last week, whilst I was running my fighting game poll over on Patreon, it was only narrowly defeated by Turtles Tournament Fighters before the deadline. So, due to popular demand, we are finally going to focus in on the maiden entry in this series. Up until fairly recently, whilst I was aware of the Guilty Gear series, I never knew that the franchise had already been around for over 20 years, stretching all the way back to the PS1 era. The majority of PlayStation owners have fond memories of playing the likes of Tekken, Soul Blade, and if they were lucky, maybe even a bit of the Street Fighter Alpha series. But what may come as a surprise to some is that Guilty Gear coexisted alongside all of those franchises. So today we are going to look at this first game in the series, its quirks, why it was so overlooked, and most importantly, why it is now considered a cult classic today. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Guilty Gear. Yeah! To begin this story, we are going to go straight back to the late 90s, to an era where the original Sony PlayStation was in its heyday, a system that sales-wise had managed to eclipse anything that came before it. Up until this point in history, the PlayStation was the most well-marketed game console of all time, which, as we all know, was down to a few important factors. One of the greatest factors was the marketing itself. The PlayStation was promoted as a grown-up console that was pushed with a library of games featuring titles that were suitable for everyone. Whilst prior to this, Nintendo had mainly targeted the children's demographic, with Sega following suit with an approach that their games and systems had more attitude. The Sony PlayStation, on the other hand, was the first console marketed to adults done right, which was obviously hugely assisted by the platform's abundance of, at the time, realistic-looking games, consisting of many titles that featured polygon-based graphics over kiddie-looking cartoony sprites. The most popular fighting series on the platform, Tekken, would feature this graphical style, as would Namco's Soul Blade 2, another one of the PlayStation's greatest fighting game hits. If you are a standard Sony PlayStation gamer, these fighting games were the ones you most likely remember having a lot of fun with. Whilst these titles were loved by most, they were not for everyone, and the most hardcore fighting game fans would often criticise these games for having slower response times compared with traditional 2D fighting games, and more casual simplified gameplay experiences than some of the titles that came before them. Hardcore fighting game enthusiasts who owned a PlayStation would regularly lean on the Street Fighter Alpha or King of Fighters series as their bread and butter, and those who ventured out to the arcades or owned Dreamcasts in the PlayStation's later years had the likes of Street Fighter 3 to play instead. Whilst all of these games handled great for those who knew what they were doing, to the mainstream they were complex and difficult to play, and looked dated compared to the state-of-the-art polygon-based graphics. Guilty Gear, first released in Japan in May of 1998, fits into the sprite-based camp, alongside the likes of Street Fighter 3, meaning that if you were into what was cool at the time, like myself I am sad to say, this would have been a release that may have flown completely over your head. The title Guilty Gear was a 2D fighting game developed by Arc System Works. Throughout the 80s and 90s they would develop a range of games for various popular platforms, perhaps making more titles for both the Sega Master System and Sega Game Gear than anything else. In fact, I have a lot of good memories playing Scramble Spirits, one of the many decent games they would develop for the Master System. Moving into the first 2-bit era, their first games they would make were known as Wizard's Harmony and Wizard's Harmony 2. Both of these titles would be simulation games that saw dual releases in Japan on both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. With the Sega Saturn curtailing in popularity, Guilty Gear would be the first Arc System Works game to be released as a Sony PlayStation console exclusive. Under the Arc System Works development label, Guilty Gear was the creation of an internal team known as Team Neoblood, under the leadership of Daisuke Ishiwatari. Like most gamers in the 90s, it will probably come as no surprise at all to you that Daisuke was a massive fan of Street Fighter 2, so as a result he began to start conceptualising his own fighting game almost immediately. In fact, even when he was still in vocational school. Eventually, once underemployment with Arc System Works, he would have the opportunity to pitch a game featuring a Street Fighter likeness, which thankfully for Daisuke was given the green light. Daisuke and his 12-person team would toil away for 18 months, making and refining his fighting game, with the hope of creating a fighting game that would not just be marketable to fighting game enthusiasts, but would be a title that was also appealing to manga and anime fans too. The main manga in question that Guilty Gear would draw a lot of its inspiration from was a series known as Bastard. Bastard is apparently themed around sorcery, revenge and other power struggles in a Dungeons and Dragons-like setting. It is a dystopian world where people need magic to survive against wild beasts and evil monsters. So essentially, Street Fighter paired with more bastards equals Guilty Gear. Apparently, there was a time during the game's early development that it was to be created using rendered 3D visuals. However, this was later replaced with hand-drawn artwork to give the game more of a manga feel. Apparently, Daisuke was convinced that all fighting games should be difficult, due to the fact that he had seen too many fighting games trying to appeal to casual audiences and failing, which personally I see as a strange mindset when we take into account the popularity of the Tekken games. In terms of the game's difficulty, we will touch more on this shortly, when we go into depth regarding this title's gameplay. Whilst I am keen to discuss this, I guess it is important to touch on the story that Guilty Gear brings to the table. We already mentioned that it was based around a magical themed manga, so in this regard there are some similarities story-wise. Whilst the game itself is set in the futuristic year of 2080, the game's story is based around events that apparently unfolded around 2010, when humanity discovered an unlimited power source known simply as magic, ending the world energy crisis for good. Despite this, humans were humans and wars persisted. The magic itself was even combined with humans and other creatures via questionable experiments, transforming them into living weapons known as gears. Gears would turn on the human race, leading to what would be known as the Crusades. After the Gears leader, known as Justice, was captured, this led to the rest ceasing to function, bringing an end to conflict. In the year 2180, a powerful gear known as Testament rises up, who plans to resurrect Justice and destroy humanity once and for all. Out of fear, nations of Earth organise a fighting tournament to find a fighter who can defeat Testament, with the winner being awarded anything they desire. 10 combatants sign up, each of which can be found on the player select screen. The game consists of combatants fighting their way through tournament stages with twists and turns in the story along the way, shaping the finale of the game, which we shall get to soon. In terms of the game's combat and fighting game mechanics, players must defeat opponents in traditional 2 out of 3 falls encounters. On the Sony PlayStation controller, the game uses a 6-button layout. These 6 buttons are assigned to a punch, a kick, 2 weapon attacks and 2 special attacks. The game also features an interesting and special mechanic known as instant kill techniques, which if executed by the player allows instant knockouts, ending matches. Apart from a life gauge, like many Capcom and SNK fighters, Guilty Gear has an additional gauge known as the tension gauge that fills up as players both land and receive attacks. Whilst holding down a specific button whilst blocking, players can even use this meter to negate damage at the cost of the tension meter decreasing. If players are able to feel the gauge will flash and players have the opportunity to input commands to perform special moves known as chaos attacks. Further to this, when a player's health bar reaches less than 50%, they enter a state known as chaos mode, and a red aura surrounds them. In this state, players can perform unlimited chaos attacks, bringing a bit more balance and complexity to the title's gameplay. As stated earlier in the video, Daisuke intentionally developed this game to have an extra layer of complexity over some other fighting games. He believed that this genre is supposed to be difficult. In further regards to this, he explained in the past that his main focus was to create a product that would satisfy its players, and that could expand the possibilities of the game itself. He also stated we wanted to come up with something different to the other games. It needed to be different. For this reason, the instant kill techniques were added. Its function was also to add tension to the fight, as someone who was winning could be defeated suddenly, something we really wanted to be a strong theme for the game. So that's the game's story, development and gameplay mechanics summarised for you, but what about the characters themselves? Characters are often one of the most memorable features of the fighting game genre, so let's take a look at the characters Daisuke's Street Fighter and manga inspired title would bring to the table. Interestingly, the first game in the series would not bring much to light regarding many of the characters' backstories. However, more would come to be known about each of them in future installments down the line. Out of the character roster, we have Axel Lowe, a gang leader from the 20th century who, due to a twist of fate, got caught into a time slip that bounces him around irregularly through time and space. We have Cliff Anderson, a formidable warrior and a member of the Sacred Order of Holy Knights during the Crusades. Cliff was its commander for decades until he retired of old age, being succeeded by Kai Kiske. Speaking of Kai Kiske, or is it Kai Kiske, he is also playable. He is also a former member of the Sacred Order of Knights during the Crusades. Kai is a very charismatic young man who possesses a strong sense of justice and a devout religiosity. There is also Melia Rage, a former member of Assassin's Guild. She fights with the skill of her former occupation. Melia uses her magical hair as a weapon, enchanted with the forbidden beast Angra. It can take any shape she wishes. We also have Potemkin, a former slave in the Zep Armed Air Empire, who was a supporter of the democratic revolution that took place. There is May, a young-looking and spunky first mate of the Jellyfish Pirates. We've got Chip Zanoff, a former drug trafficker and addict. Further to this, there is Dr. Baldhead, formerly a physician of great renown and skill. The mysterious death of one of his patients during a surgery drove him mad, thinking he had committed malpractice. In his insanity, he became a violent serial killer. We then have Zato 1, the rightful leader of the Assassin's Guild until his fall from grace, brought about by his former lover Melia Rage. And then we have Soul Bad Guy, the main protagonist of the series and Kai Kiske's eternal rival. He is an aloof and brash bounty hunter whose apparent laziness and gruffness belies a terrifying fighting ability, intelligence and emotional depths beneath. In the game's story, the second to last opponent in the game's tournament is Testament. Testament is able to wield odd magic and fights with both a scythe and impressive moveset consisting of summons, as well as having power over yokai familiars. Obviously, being the second to last opponent in the game, despite players' best efforts, justice is resurrected regardless. In this tough fight, players compete against the first complete gear with free will and with the power to control all of her own kind. After an arduous battle, justice is defeated, restoring peace for the time being. The game also features an additional unlockable playable character in the form of Baiken. She is an aggressive, brash, impulsive and antisocial person motivated solely by revenge. So I guess now we have pretty much covered much of what Guilty Gear could offer to the players. With this said, let's see what journalists from big publications made of this game back in 1998. GameSpot stated that, in a world occupied by two kinds of 2D fighters, Capcom's and everyone else's, you have to be cut from a different kind of cloth in order to survive in this hostile environment. In development for almost 3 years, Guilty Gear is just that, a 2D fighter with enough originality and flavour to earn its own place in this once dominant genre. To summarise the Guilty Gear experience is to look to the best parts of other 4-star fighting games. Fast, furious action with truly awesome characters and moves worthy of the Darkstalkers series. Guilty Gear is one of the few non-Capcom or SNK 2D fighters to make any sort of impact on the genre. If you like 2D fighters with a little flair, GG comes highly recommended. With its excellent gameplay, surprisingly good graphics, secret characters and kick-ass oral experience, Guilty Gear is as good as it gets. IGN would add to the conversation with, good 2D fighting games are hard to come by in this day of polygonal powerhouses such as PlayStation. Capcom has met with continued success, but has gone largely unchallenged in the field. Enter the unknowns, Japanese developer Team Neoblood, and its contribution to the annals of 2D fighting, Guilty Gear. It's an absolute joy to play. Fighting doesn't get much more frantic than this either. The game's combo system borders on the excessive, and gameplay speed is fast. Whilst IGN offered mostly praise, they would offer a touch of criticism too, stating that their two biggest gripes, some moves are simply too powerful, and the computer AI is downright fiendish. They're not enough to tarnish the game's otherwise excellent presentation, however. Guilty Gear may fall just short of the greats, but it's still deserving of classic status. It's a wonder that such an excellent game came virtually out of nowhere. If you consider yourself a fighting connoisseur, it comes highly recommended. No true fan of the genre should be without a copy. Across the board, journalist response was pretty similar, resulting in the title receiving a 78.44% score on Metacritic. Despite the game's overall quality, the title was never a huge system seller, which personally I would put down to a combination of the lack of name value at the time of the game's release, and the fact that 3D polygon-based experiences were still at the forefront of consumer consciousness, and many gamers at the time were not willing to entertain the idea of anything else. When you take into account that the game took a lot of inspiration from manga and anime, those entertainment mediums were even less mainstream in the late 90s in the West than they are now. The game wasn't really something that the mass consumer market were craving at the time, particularly when you take into account the game's difficulty, complexity and sprite-based graphics. The game is basically the Street Fighter III of the PlayStation, a game that is heralded as an all-time great by the fighting game community today, but was only really recognised as something special by the most hardcore of 2D fighting game connoisseurs at the time. But the fact that this is a game that has received so many sequels, and I have had so many requests to cover this game, it's all proof really that the franchise is snowballing in popularity up until this day, even if many people overlooked the game at first. These days, Guilty Gear is labelled as one of the few fighting games of its era to cause any sort of long-term impact on the genre. This is of course with the exception of titles released by Capcom, SNK and Namco in the time frame, but Guilty Gears is more important today than ever before, as illustrated as well by its re-releases on more modern pieces of hardware, celebrating the game's 20th anniversary of the franchise, introducing more players to the classic game than ever. All in all, ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Guilty Gear, the history of a cult classic. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you subscribe and spend some time watching my backlog of videos, including my weekly content celebrating the history of fighting games. Today's video was chosen via the use of a democratic exercise between my channel's patrons. For as little as just $1 a month, patrons can get all future content ad-free, early access on videos before anyone else, weekly exclusive behind the scenes vlog style content such as me revealing what's inside this box from my childhood, and you can also gain access to my new Discord and much more. And this is just a $1 tier, ladies and gentlemen. So to reiterate, this video that you watched today was mostly funded by our lovely channel backers over on the Patreon platform. So massive shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Razmik, Doug Perkins, SpongeMac BYT, Ego Alephia Swanson, Angel Light 85, Asobi Quang DX, Azrael Warakai, Brian Barry, Cambo Rambo 82, Carlos Domingos, Computer Man, Daniel Daly, ECU Professor, Gary Pinkett, Gianni V Santizi, Glenny Glenn, Hamid Musa, House of the Ted, Joaquin Varela, Jordan Durant, Heo Vinagre, Keith Ferguson, Lars Zondervan, Matthew Robinson, Michael Cullix, Nick Daniels, Philip Manth, Prince Knight, Princess Zana, Timothy W. Haskins II, TOD Driver, Stint Spacies, A Murder of Crows, Adam Castin, Adrian Hannington, Andis Reinsberg, Andrew Bazanski, Andrew Pearson, Antonio Rodriguez, Bernard NG, Bubba Kitty, Chris Fisk, Chris Margarine, Chris Cool, Craig Jenkins, Crazy Yarl, Dan Barlow Jr., David Bell, Francesco Lacriola, Gregory Smorajiewicz, Hans Christian, Ivan M, Jake Whitford, James McDonald, JB, Jazzy Tay, Joel, John Bates, Casey Wright, Kingsley, Langston Miller, Lobster Puncher, Luis Viant, Luke Canava, Marco Soto, Marvin Aroliga, Master Jinx, Matthew Rindle, Mean Machine Dean, Michael Hall, Mike Bruno, Noob, Paul Elliott, Posty XL, Punky Dudestar, RetroAversion.com, Richard Stew Stewart, Rick67, Ron Studd, Sarah Powell, Soraya H, Al Sarayi, Stephen Lewis, Time Lord Soundwave, Tom Elliott, Vlay Mink Renee, Wazzo Jugs, Zai. Thank you very much to all of you and everyone else who chooses to back this channel. I love you all very much. Yeah.